technical difficulties, and so sorry for the slight delay. But thank you for joining us today for this panel discussion on the topic of governance in the age of COVID-19 response. I'm Tim Hanstead. I'm the CEO of the Chandler Foundation. I'm honored to be your moderator today. And I want to thank Catalyst 2030 for sponsoring this series that we are a part of. Catalyst 2030 is a new global movement of social innovators working to achieve the SDGs through collaboration and by embracing a systems mindset. You can learn more about Catalyst 23 at catalyst23.net. Now, on to our topic for the hour. I have a terrific panel, and I'm going to introduce them in a minute, but first a bit about the topic. So philanthropy has committed billions of dollars in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Yet governments have committed trillions. And the role that government is playing in responding to this pandemic and in preparing for the next one is obviously crucial. What can donors and doers do to help improve the way governments spend those resources and generally govern more effectively? Can we, as donors and doers, have an outsized impact by supporting efforts to improve government efficiency, accountability, and effectiveness in response to the pandemic? And what steps can we take, if any, to help develop good governance and good government for the longer term? Now, I have a terrific panel with me today to discuss the topic. We're going to spend about 35 minutes in conversation and then take questions from the audience. So please, those of you in the virtual audience, again, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Please submit your questions on the chat function throughout, and we'll get to them at the end. Now to introduce our fabulous panel. Let me start with Julie McCarthy. Julie is the co-director of the Economic Justice Program and Soros Economic Development Fund at Open Society Foundations. Prior to that, she served as director of the Fiscal Governance Program at OSF. Julie has served as a senior advisor at the Transparency and Accountability Initiative, working with the Obama administration and the Brazilian government to develop and launch the Open Government Partnership. Next, we have Chris Stone. Chris is currently Professor of Practice of Public Integrity at the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford University. Chris is the past president of the Open Society Foundations. Prior to OSF, Chris was Professor of Practice at the Harvard Kennedy School, where he was also faculty director of the Hauser Center on Nonprofit Organizations. Chris's current work is on what he calls public corruption turnarounds. That is, the ways in which leaders in government can replace cultures of corruption with cultures of integrity. And last but not least, Catherine Frauscher. Catherine is the Deputy Executive Director and one of the co-founders of Open Contracting Partnership. Catherine's journey as a social entrepreneur started in an unlikely place, the World Bank Institute, which is the incubation lab of the World Bank. And at the World Bank, Catherine worked in countries such as Uganda, Nigeria, Mongolia, on changing sectors, including mining, construction, and service delivery. And once she realized the potentially massive impacts that more accountable public procurement processes could have, there was no turning back. Catherine works daily to change how contracting can deliver value for everyone. So let's jump into the questions. Julie, I think I'll start with you. I know we had some technical difficulties, so hopefully
Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Great.
Thank you, Julie. Thanks for joining us. Julie, when there are so many people suffering from the health and economic impacts of the pandemic, and thus so many opportunities for philanthropists to support efforts aimed at providing direct services to those who are hurting, why should we be thinking about good governance? Maybe put it another way, what is the case for philanthropists to direct at least part of their COVID-19 response dollars or effort to address issues of good governance?
Great. Thank you so much, Tim, and to Catalyst 2030 for organizing this discussion on a critically important topic. Really happy to be here in conversation with all of you, and it's a great question that you ask. So Tim, as you noted, we've seen trillions of dollars move at incredible speed in countries around the world to try and respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. And as with all emergencies, we need to make sure that we balance the real and very grave need to move with speed, to also have some measure of public oversight at the same time, so that we ensure as best that we can that financial assistance is actually reaching those who it's intended to benefit and who are in desperate need right now. So according to the IMF's most recent figures as of April, countries have spent around $9 trillion trying to help people and firms get through this period of economic crisis and health crisis. And just to put it in perspective, that astronomical sum, that's more than twice the annual budget of the United States for last year. So it's quite possible, if we aren't careful, that we look back 5 years from now in horror at just how much of that money actually ended up lining the pockets of a really small elite at the expense of millions of lives and broader economic destruction. So under any circumstances, graft can undermine the best of donor intentions to try and address social problems. But in emergency situations, and especially a deadly pandemic, the stakes of donor resources being mismanaged or redirected away from those in need are particularly acute. So just to give one example, if you put money into a fund that's supposed to be buying PPE, personal protective equipment for frontline workers, and instead of those workers starting to promptly receive their shipments of N95 masks, after many weeks instead, these workers receive ineffective knockoff masks that were charged at an exorbitant price from a company set up overnight by the Minister of Health's brother. You've inadvertently not only helped put these workers and their patients at further risk, but obviously you've contributed inadvertently to corruption. But there's another circumstance. Imagine that none of this funding is stolen, but it turns out that all of the PPE only went to a small group of hospitals in the wealthiest areas of a particular city or country, rather than targeting the worst affected, least capacitated hospitals in lower income communities. So stories like this, and I'm sure Catherine will have some great examples to give us, are unfortunately all too real in this Wild West environment of spend now and explain later. If you look at the World Bank and the IMF's guidance to countries right now, it's basically keep the receipts. Spend, and keep the receipts, and hopefully we'll account for it later. And I really strongly believe that we can do better than that. We've seen countries do a lot better than that in previous experience, and I think there's a basic duty of care that we have as donors when it involves providing COVID-19 relief funds in all governance contexts, weak and strong, from South Africa and Mexico to the US, to abide by three basic principles of governance. The first is transparency. We want to know how much money there is and where the government is committing it, so that we know what the priorities are and we can track it as it goes along. The second is accountability. We want to make sure that as much as possible, none of that money is stolen or mismanaged along the way. So we need some independent scrutiny of some form to monitor how that money is being spent. And the third, and the one that's most often forgotten or overlooked in the context of governance discussions of relief spending or in general, is participation. So making sure that governments and donors, in order to make sure that governments and donors are spending money in the right places and that gaps are being surfaced, we need governments to establish or draw on existing mechanisms for listening to their populations, especially the most vulnerable, and being able to adapt their funding in response.
Great, thank you, Julie. And moving to Chris, what lessons do we have, if any, about concerning the risk based on past emergency funds? What are the good practices or tools out there that might be applied?
Well, Tim, it's a nice, it picks up nicely on what Julie was talking about. I mean, emergencies almost always become an excuse for setting aside the procedures that protect against theft and misappropriation. And it's totally understandable because you've got to, when speed is essential, you have to, you can't use a lot of the same protections. But that doesn't mean you just throw open the doors to the public treasury and let the looting begin. You need to shift from routine controls on corruption to emergency controls, and those have to be calibrated to the emergency need. From one perspective, frankly, I think it's already too late for this pandemic. There will be more attempts to steal money, but the world's wealthy elites have already secured the big money. And that's because the way state capture works, that's the situation in which self-interested elites shape the rules of the game themselves, write the laws themselves, allocating the big money to themselves completely within the law. And we've already seen that, that's already happened. There's already been a lot of reportage about that. But from a different perspective, this is the perfect time to be strengthening the oversight in ways that might both reduce opportunities for further theft now, and also build stronger financial oversight for the future. And I think that's the real lesson from past emergencies. The key is to build temporary public-private partnerships to oversee the emergency expenditures and to build them with the public institutions, build them with those public institutions that will remain in place after the emergency, using the temporary partnership to strengthen the permanent institution. And South Africa, for example, provides a great illustration of how you could do this right now. 2 weeks ago, in an address to the nation, South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa described his government's 500 billion rand package of social and economic assistance for the coronavirus recovery. That's roughly 30 billion US dollars. At the end of his address, he promised South Africans that the funds would not be wasted and that the funds would not be stolen. That he even felt he had to say that in an address to the nation is itself a remarkable acknowledgement of the people's skepticism and the risk that you point to. But that 500 billion rand package is made up of public and private funds, including a huge solidarity fund contributed by private individuals and corporations, and a South African Futures Trust that also is private funding. It's a perfect opportunity for a public-private oversight mechanism that might monitor the public and private funding pools together and strengthen the skills and confidence of the Auditor General's office. So I think the lesson, in short, is build temporary public-private oversight mechanisms that are fast, that can take the place of the regulations that are set aside, and that can build future strength.
Right, thanks. Thanks, Chris. And that it's a good segue in for Catherine to talk a bit about what Open Contracting Partnerships is doing. Catherine, Open Contracting Partnership works with multilaterals, but you also work with governments around the world. Give us some examples of the way that you are working with governments and promoting a transparent, more effective, and accountable recovery spending during this crisis.
Great, thank you. And you already have heard procurement come up over and over again with the last two speakers and in your introduction. And it's really that COVID-19 has thrown public procurement into the spotlight, right? I think if people were wondering, but what is procurement and why does it matter? And is it a boring compliance exercise, right? Suddenly it's on the news, it's in the newspapers, because we all hear how governments around the world, so in the US and in anywhere in Africa or everywhere at the city or the national level, are struggling to get these much needed medical supplies fast. And I think it's important to mention again what Julie just said. It's not just important that they get them fast, because that can save lives, but they also have to come at the specified quality and at a fair price. And I think we have seen the horror stories everywhere, how procurement is going wrong, right? Procurement is always government's #1 corruption risks. in an emergency situation like now, when many governments are using it as an excuse to not have transparency and accountability measures in place, those risks are even higher. So we have seen in the US, right, where equipment has been ordered but never materialized. We have heard about stories in Bulgaria where they ordered ventilators, but they got right dates delivered. But also in inflated prices, right, that are hurting the poor and underserved communities the most. In Colombia, we know that inflated food prices were so much higher that other families could have been fed for, 50,000 families could have been fed for that amount of money. And I think that is something that we can't forget, that really it's the underserved, marginalized communities. You know, here in the United States, we know that Hispanic and Black communities are harder hit by the virus, and they also suffer the most from inadequate access to those medical supplies and by the economic recovery. So I think that's maybe a dimension that we haven't talked about yet, is that procurement will remain important in the recovery and not just in the emergency response. Because if you want to rebuild this economy in an equitable way, where you help minority-owned businesses, where you help minimum-owned businesses or workers, as Julie mentioned before, the way government will give contracts, to whom they will give it, for what, all will matter a lot. And those are exactly the kind of things that we are working on with our community. So we have seen in the past 4 months that countries and cities that have data-driven procurement, that have digitized procurement, that work in partnership with both companies and civil societies can get better results. And better doesn't mean just faster, but it means with more accountability, with more transparency, and at a better price. And we have seen that in Ukraine, where we helped a coalition of reformers to come together, and they were able to make those contracts public despite the emergency, right? And to plan better by aggregating the results, the needs of the hospitals, as Julie mentioned before, right? To make sure that all hospitals get what they need and not just a few rich ones. And then also monitor with civil society of how the delivery is actually going. And going forward, because we care about the recovery and working with marginalized communities, we are working with the city of New Orleans, which is one of the hardest hit cities in the United States, how they can use contracting to serve their Black-owned and women-owned businesses better.
Thanks, Catherine. I want to come back to you later with some more questions about your good work. But Julie, back to you. OSF recently announced, I think it was $130 million as a COVID response fund. How are those resources being used to invest in better governance, both to support immediate response efforts and to build long-term resilience?
So OSF's first round of COVID response, and there's going to be a few, which I'll talk about in a second, was an initial $130 million that had a very heavy focus on a few areas, namely getting financial support to the most vulnerable who weren't benefiting from some of the federal schemes that were coming out in the US and elsewhere, supporting equitable access to treatment and vaccines, and addressing the rights of at-risk populations, such as those in mandatory detention or migrants and refugees, and then finally addressing attempts by authoritarian leaders to further consolidate their power in the midst of this pandemic. So we targeted about half of those initial resources, about 60 million, at the city of New York, which was the epicenter of the pandemic, as we all recall, in March and April, around the time that we were redirecting these resources. And we had a major emphasis on getting cash into the hands of the most vulnerable, namely undocumented immigrant populations in New York. The governance dimensions of this work were a bit sui generis in that the city was actually asking for our help in figuring out how to identify and get money to vulnerable individuals in a way that respected their privacy and safety, because obviously a lot of these people were really reluctant, understandably, to engage with government actors. So through our work with the National Domestic Workers Alliance and their ALIA platform, we're not only able to make this happen in New York City, but also in, I think it's now more than a dozen other cities in the US, where going forward, city governments will have a standing, secure platform to transfer public resources to vulnerable families in ways that they did not prior to COVID-19, and that hopefully can be put into action in the future for things like climate-related disaster and whatnot going forward. There has been huge participation from community-based organizations in collaboration with the city, and these, to Chris's point, these funds will be subject to annual audit by the city comptroller. So I think we did a decent job there. Now, I will say we also made smaller contributions to South Africa's Solidarity Fund and to the cities of Milan and Budapest with very few strings attached, based on close, long-standing relationships with leaders in those geographies on a wide range of open society concerns. And I think in retrospect, we should have paused not only to confirm that these funds would come under the direct oversight of auditors general, but also that their use and beneficiaries would be disclosed to the public on a regular basis. And that's something that we have to work backwards on now, which is always a bit more difficult than doing it up front. We also provided support to the Open Contracting Partnership and Transparency International in our first round of funding, to do the really important and inspiring work that Catherine was discussing around safeguarding governance of emergency procurement in the health sector. And now, as we are looking to give out another 70 million in the coming months with a focus on the Global South, we're really lifting up this issue of accountability of COVID response funds as a core concern that we'll be dedicating a cross-cutting campaign to within the foundation. Just briefly, we're thinking a lot about debt relief and how that can be leveraged to ensure that things like real-time transparency, disclosure of funds received by governments, of how the government intends to spend them, of giving the public an opportunity to weigh in on public spending priorities, and commitment to oversight by auditors general are basic conditions of receiving access to different kinds of grants and loans and debt suspension. There is a concern that countries get debt relief, and then instead of spending that money on health and social protection, they introduce a heavy diet of austerity for the general public, and then use those resources to shore up a narrower group of political and economic elites. And then finally, we're also thinking a lot about how to leverage the wonderful work of groups like the International Budget Partnership and the Open Government Partnership to work with different regional and national institutions that are interested in committing to a set of basic good governance commitments as part of their COVID-19 response, as part of their commitment to SDG 16, a spirit of good governance and accountability. And I'll just end by noting that the Open Government Partnership has a wonderful open response and open recovery series that they're running that has a lot of great insights for donors and for civil society around how different countries and communities and constituencies are navigating governance concerns right now in the COVID-19 response.
You're on mute.
Sorry about that. Lots of people would like it if I were on mute more often, probably. Chris, you've spent much time, effort, your expertise on the issue of corruption. Why is this issue of corruption important? Why is it maybe particularly important during this time? What should the funders, the social entrepreneurs, the NGOs in the audience know about corruption or be thinking about corruption as they do their work?
Let me see if I can connect this all up. I mean, people have always resented petty corruption, even when they learn to live with it. But I think what's new in the last few years, maybe the last couple of decades, is, and what demands, I think, the attention of just the funders, civil society, social entrepreneurs right now, is people's revulsion against elite corruption. What's playing out on the streets of Beirut, Santiago, Port-au-Prince, Bucharest, Moscow, Tel Aviv, you name it, and in some ways on hold because of the pandemic, but in other ways actually persisting right in the midst of the pandemic, is a battle between private interests and the public interests. And in some ways, what's happening around the world is the public interest is fighting back. People's anger at corruption is a rejection of rising state-protected inequality. People's anger at corruption is a refusal to give in to cynicism, which is remarkable to see. And people's anger at corruption expresses a hope that the public interest is more than the sum of competing private interests. But the anger, and this is the point for, I think, social entrepreneurs, for civil society, for donors, the anger, this public rejection, this refusal, this hope is not enough. Funders, civil society, social entrepreneurs need to pay attention, because the public anger is powerful but not sufficient to advance the public interest without their active engagement, without our active engagement. You can't advance the public interest just by denouncing corruption. You need to build institutions with integrity. That's what donors and social entrepreneurs can do with imagination, with courage, and with real world results, especially if they use some of the tools that Catherine and Julie have been talking about, particularly if they build in participation.
And just to follow up to that, Chris, is I imagine this period is a window of opportunity, perhaps, where we could change the trajectory in a positive way on the issue of corruption. But one can also imagine a scenario where it going the opposite direction. Do you see it? Are we at a potential inflection point here with with the response to COVID, and what can we do to prevent the bad scenario and promote the good one?
Well, I mean, it's great, and obviously nobody knows the answer to that. I do think the cliche one here is repeated over and over again these days, is that now COVID isn't going to change the world. It's going to accelerate a lot of trends that were already building before the pandemic hit. And so how it plays out with corruption is fascinating, because of course we've been seeing, in some ways we've been seeing, the movement and organizing and public pressure for greater integrity building. And we've also been seeing more, grosser and grosser illustrations of corruption and state capture. Just this morning, the federal police raid in Brazil, police raided the governor of Rio's private residence as part of their investigation over these last couple of days across multiple states, investigation into the misappropriation of COVID-19 contracts, and particularly the building of the temporary public hospitals. So you're seeing, quite rapid, quite aggressive anti-corruption, integrity policing, integrity investigations in some places, even when you're seeing examples of poor governance right alongside it. I think the fight is right now, and the fight is right over these issues. And I think what we're going to be seeing is a lot of creativity, a lot of really exciting developments and accelerated developments in building structures of public integrity. That's what I was talking a minute ago out in South Africa. I think that's what Julie was talking about, OSF trying to fund around the world. At the same time, we're seeing absolutely horrendous levels of theft and capture in this response, and a lot of people just focusing on how they're going to get, how they're going to get rich in this pandemic, and a lot of people are already getting rich in the pandemic.
Catherine, back to you, please. What do you think funders could do to better promote a transparent, effective, and accountable recovery from the crisis?
Great. Again, as we're hearing all the horror stories about procurement, right? I think it's really recognizing the crucial importance of public procurement, because we believe, right, there can be no equitable and effective recovery from COVID-19 if you don't get procurement right. And I think it was Chris and Julie just said, you don't just want to fix it after it happened, right? You want to prevent it from happening before. And that's where good procurement planning, early oversight and collaboration comes in and is so important. And that is something that we are working on. And that's why we appreciate, funders such as OSF and also the Chandler Foundation, who are helping us to bring that to countries and work with them, because they want to have those safeguards and the transparency in place. And I think for multilateral development banks, right, Julie also mentioned them in the beginning, they are giving out large amounts of money. And we do think it's very important there as well that they have the safeguards and full transparency in place as well. And that's not always the case yet. So there is a huge role to play for funders to both, practice what they preach, and also invest in not only fixing the problems, but preventing them already now.
And Catherine, what about, you work directly on procurement. I think you're quite unique in that respect, but what about the other doers in our virtual audience? What about NGOs, social entrepreneurs who aren't working directly on procurement, but are working on issues maybe adjacent to it or related to procurement in some way? What do they need to be aware of? What can they do?
Definitely, great question. I think many of us work on impact, and our ultimate goal is to get better impact, which right now means, better, fair public services, good and works. You want that everyone gets the medical supplies that they need, right? That everyone gets an economic opportunity to recover from this crisis. And again, for that, it is really important that you get procurement right. So if you are a social entrepreneur or a nonprofit that works on impact in health, in food, in social services, or in infrastructure, procurement really matters, and having open and smart and fair public procurement is one of the ways of getting there. And we run an impact accelerator program called LIFT, and that focuses exactly on those issues. So in the city of Buenos Aires, we work on empowering women-owned businesses. In Mexico City, we are working on the bike share program that is coming up for retendering. Or in Moldova, for example, it's one of the countries in Europe with the highest rates for HIV and TB. And we work with them on using procurement to improve those essential services. And we have seen in the last 4 months, the work that the teams have been able to do during the COVID crisis was impressive, right? They were able to adapt and help make those procurements better, to make them more transparent. And again, what we said before, partner with organizations in their communities to also be more fair and equitable. So if you are a social impact investor or a social entrepreneur going after impact, I think looking at procurement is really important right now.
Thank you, Catherine. I want to go to some questions we have from the audience who submitted through the chat function, and encourage others in the audience to also submit your questions to this incredible panel with an incredible range of kind of expertise and experience on the issue. So we have a question here from Carol. How are funders strengthening institutions for truthful media and investigative reporting as another way to ensure transparency and accountability? And maybe if I could just add a friendly amendment to that question is why is this important? Julie?
Sure, I'm happy to come in on that. And I would just add, because there's another question in there that's around, similarly, the institutions of civil society playing an oversight mechanism as well as media, and I think both of them are really important. So I've seen incredible examples of civil society and investigative journalism organizations pivoting to refocus their work and their efforts around COVID-19 response accountability concerns. So there's one group in Nigeria, the National Federation of Women Farmers, that's partnering with the International Center for Investigative Reporting to monitor all of the federal government's pandemic-related stimulus packages and social protection programs to try and document the impact on vulnerable female farmers, and then get those stories into national op-eds and feature writing at the national level We've seen an example in Senegal, for example, of civil society, the National Federation of People with Disabilities, turning really quickly to develop an advocacy strategy to engage government to ensure that their members benefited from COVID-19 assistance. And through their advocacy, not only were they then formally deemed eligible to receive assistance, but they've been invited to join these national and local COVID-19 response committees that the government has set up. These groups are in turn engaged with one of the partners that we support that I mentioned earlier, the International Budget Partnership. And so, I think that there are a lot of ways right now to do direct local grassroots support, to support groups like the African Investigative Journalists Network Coalition and the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project and Transparency International, many of the international groups that are well connected to local groups, where we're seeing some really powerful partnerships that go sort of global to local of people pivoting. And I would just make one further point of note in terms of the importance of really strengthening that domestic oversight capacity and with the media and civil society right now, which is that more broadly, public expenditure reprioritization is happening so rapidly and without any formal scrutiny right now. And for those of us who care about inequality, that leaves a lot of room for error. If as a donor you're giving money to support health or social protection needs, a government receiving those funds may well feel then that they can deprioritize the area and they don't need to spend there anymore and they can go spend somewhere else. And so it's this independent civil society and journalistic oversight on the ground that's really calling out when this is happening, bringing it into public conversation and allowing an opportunity to really correct. And if I could, just one final point, I think if there's any takeaway for people in this conversation around good governance, it's that in COVID response funds, it's the importance is not just that we're worried about people stealing money and resources. That is a concern, that is something that happens, and that's something that we need to be attuned to. But there's a broader issue of greater transparency and opportunities for public participation, really offering an opportunity to help governments more effectively prioritize and direct their response funds to those who need it. And there are plenty of instances of governments who'd like to be doing better at targeting underserved populations. And it takes those mechanisms of two-way communication and dialogue in order for these asymmetries of information and power to really be addressed at the local level.
Great answer. We have another question from Michael Jarvis from the Transparency and Accountability Initiative. Michael writes, commitments by OSF and others are excellent steps, but drops in the ocean compared to the size of the public responses. So is there a case to align with other funders to get more notice or traction on the governance aspects? Chris, you must have thought about this as you were leading OSF, certainly, and probably continue to. You have a response for Michael? You're on mute, Chris.
So I guess I have a response. I don't know how helpful it is. I mean, one of the problems with donor partnerships is they can quickly move to the lowest. The risk tolerance becomes the lowest common risk tolerance. So if you have funders working together and one of them is too nervous about a project, often that project doesn't move forward. Whereas if you can build funder partnerships in which each donor maintains their own portfolio of work, makes their own investments, but shares information, knows what others are doing, you can actually raise the risk tolerance of the group as a whole, because donors realize that nobody else is doing what they're doing, and they may make greater investments where they're willing to take the greatest risks. So I think these donor partnerships can be risk suppressors or risk encouragers, and the challenge is to build them in a way that increase risk tolerance in an emergency or in important situation rather than constrain it. That's it's very sort of inside the inside the industry perspective. Donors don't have the same incentives to work together that exist in other industries, and so donor relationships depend a lot on the personal trust and relations between the individuals in those donor organizations, whether they're international financial institutions or bilateral donors or philanthropic donors. I think what you want to do is play on where those relationships are strong and build structures that improve risk tolerance rather than suppress them.
Thanks. Another question here from Yawa at Emerging Public Leaders. This is specifically directed to Chris. Chris, what you said about building institutions with integrity resonates with me deeply. It's impossible to build strong state institutions without great talent. Pandemic's drawing attention to the fact we must have competent, ethical government workers in place to keep government running and to effectively respond to crisis. How have funders stepped up to make deliberate investments in talent and capacity in the government sector? And it was directed at Chris, but Julie, Catherine.
Well, I'll just go very quickly because I answered it in the chat also, so I won't repeat what I said there. But let me just, I think the point of the question, the unstated point of the question is great, which is not enough, right? The fact is funders of all kinds worry that big investment in talent is too long-term. They get impatient and they don't make those investments. So I think the thrust of your question is really right. And we have to find ways of investing in talent, both in the short term and the long term, more than we do. But that said, I do think that emergencies like this are fantastic opportunities to spot talent you overlooked before. Whatever the emergency is, moments like this give people a chance to step up and stand up and be noticed in a way we didn't see them before. So as long as donors are honing their talent spotting skills and investing in organizations that are good at spotting talent, there are opportunities to support and fast track some of that talent investment that you mentioned. But let me let Julie or some others come in and talk about what donors can do in a moment like this.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo, not being a funder, but that it resonates with me, right? I think one thing that we struggle on the procurement side is that in many cities and national governments, right, procurement teams are often understaffed. And especially if you look, as I said before, because to get impact from procurement, right, it needs to be linked to a goal in social services or in public works, and the data need to come in, right? So if you take this collectively, we have often seen that a project fails because of limited capacity on the team side. So with the LIFT program that I mentioned before, that is something that we changed, where we are working with high capacity teams, and we are especially investing in building their capacity and making the team bigger so that they can deliver. So I think it is a really important point. And I don't know, I think on the point of spotting talent, yes and no. I think in these times when all of us work incredibly hard and do childcare and do all kind of other things, I think it can be hard to be the brightest and shine like that sometimes. So I think there's a whole other dimension of how do you support people right now so that they can be and bring their talent to the table when it's that difficult.
Okay, we have a question from Joe Powell at Open Government Partnership. And Joe writes, in addition to the short-term relevance, what kind of shifts do you think will crop up in the longer term for organizations working on governance and corruption? What are they? Specifically, he goes on, we expect more, for example, we expect more work and focus on tax justice, preventing tax avoidance, ensuring that momentum on climate governance is lost, et cetera. But what else should orgs in the field be working towards?
So I can come in with one or two thoughts there, and it also aligns with work that OSF is thinking about more medium and long term in light of the COVID crisis with us now and the climate crisis that preceded it and will outlast it, that we also have to navigate. And so obviously there will come a time when we move from being in the midst of the pandemic to being in the recovery phase from the pandemic. And a lot of us are really thinking about how to not build back to the status quo, but to build back better in terms of a more just and a more sustainable economy. So to your point, Joe, I think obviously in a period of prolonged immense fiscal constraint and debt, there's going to be a lot of attention to where governments in the global north and south can increase their revenue in the near term, and that's going to make issues like illicit financial flows and tax evasion, tax avoidance, tax avoision, as the community likes to refer to it, is going to be at the top of the list of concerns for very obvious reasons. We saw that, frankly, coming out of the 2008 financial crisis as well, when governments in Europe, for example, were looking for tax revenue from the big tech companies in order to deal with the austerity that they were experiencing. But I also think, there's another area that OSF is really looking at in terms of what it takes to achieve a green economic recovery, and all of the vested interests in the dirty energy economy that we have right now that present a lot of barriers to progressive policies passing that put sustainability more at the heart of public policy in places like the US and Europe. And so we're thinking a lot about how to take on the outsized influence of the polluters, for example, in terms of accessing subsidies at enormous rates and saying one thing in terms of green economic policy and doing another in terms of their investment in tar sands and coal plants, and the bribery that goes on in different countries to compel them to agree to build new coal-fired plants, et cetera. So that's another frontier than in a context of thinking about a green and just recovery from COVID that I expect there to be a lot more attention at OSF going forward.
I think, Tim, we also might, I think it's worth pointing out that I think pandemics strengthen governments. Governments will come out of this global pandemic with more muscle, more force, more forceful intervention in their societies than they were making before. And because of all the debt holders are going to come out very powerfully. Well, I think for any organization looking long term, there's going to be a shift of power, even more towards states and even more towards debt holders in this moment, and that's probably going to affect some of the strategies that Joe you're talking about in that question.
Great. And just at the very end, I would say I think that it's so important to pay attention to inequalities. I live in Washington, D.C. My daughter goes to what's here called is a Title I school, right, where most of the kids are from low-income neighborhoods. And we are already hearing, right, next year, D.C. will have to cut their budget. In the neighborhood where we live, there are less property taxes. So, who will suffer the most from that are those, 3 to 12-year-old kids, right, because they will get less funding. They're cutting everything from teachers to supplies. And I think that aspect of equality, when states and cities are experiencing, budget crunches that we haven't seen in decades, I think will be really important.
Great, thank you. Let's see, we have a question from Alan Hudson. Alan wonders, what can donors do to incentivize greater integrity, including from at least some of the powerful players who currently benefit from the status quo?
I'm happy to come in quickly here. I think, as we discussed earlier, and as Chris was just putting a finer point on, financial relief is, just extraordinarily in need right now, across the board and all global north to south, high income to low income country contexts. And there's always moments of leverage when one is formulating those agreements in order to set out a basic set of expectations around public integrity, oversight, disclosure of information. So, I think that's a place where whether it's, donors like us who are, as others have mentioned, really giving kind of peanuts in the scheme of things, or it's the G20 governments and the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank that are giving much larger influxes of injections of direct budget support and different kinds of loan and grant support, that we need to be putting a lot of pressure on those institutions to do better. I will say that the South Africa Solidarity Fund that Chris mentioned earlier is one example, while by no means perfect and moving towards the public-private oversight commission that he mentioned, that's actually formally under the Auditor General, is absolutely the sort of next step that it needs to follow in order to kind of be best in class. We're already seeing they've, created a Google map where they're showing beneficiaries of funds and trying to do a really good job on the fly at being as transparent and, participatory as they can about how they're managing these resources in the meantime. So, while leverage and conditionality of funds is one important kind of tried and tested technique, we're also seeing sort of bottom up innovation coming from countries in this domain around trying to ensure greater integrity, to restore trust in governments where it's at an all-time low in a context like South Africa, that are really important to pay attention to and to try and encourage others to follow those examples.
Chris, do you want to weigh in on this one? You're on mute.
No, I'm not sure I'm going to add anything. Why don't we keep going?
Okay. Well, we're going to have to wrap up. I want to just on that last point point out to everyone on the call that Alan has included a link to a podcast that I haven't heard it, but it's mush.com and discussing the anti-corruption evidence. So take a look at that or listen to that. So this was only scheduled for an hour and we want to wrap up in time. But before we do that, let me thank the panelists again and ask each of the panelists to spend 90 seconds each giving us some kind of parting observations or words of wisdom. And Catherine, why don't we start with you?
Thank you. It's not a wisdom, but maybe a wish, right? That if we have this panel again in a year or two from now, that we can come back together. And as Julie said before, we can look back and say we were able to rebuild better together, in a more open and fair and equitable manner. I think that's a tall order, but there's always hope.
Good. Yeah, let's hear it for hope. Julie?
Yeah, maybe just going back to those three principles I mentioned earlier of transparency, accountability, and participation. We have good historical examples of emergency response where government has done really well here. I would encourage you to look at the government of Indonesia's response to the 2004 tsunami in Aceh under Kuntoro Mangkusubroto's leadership. There's a remarkable effort at rebuilding with the deeply integrated attention to governance. We've seen governments and donors do a terrible job on these principles, and I think the response to the 2010 earthquake in Haiti, is the worst case example that keeps me up at night in terms of, 13 billion in aid, moving through that tiny little half of an island, and 44% of it never reaching the intended beneficiaries. And so that's the sort of worst case catastrophic scenario with COVID-19 that we're facing. And finally, we've seen examples of countries that started off terribly, like the United States when it was managing Iraq's oil revenues under occupation, and got a lot better because of external pressure. And by the end of our experience there, we had a special inspector general that was producing outstanding forensic analysis of how the US was managing Iraq's oil money. So people can also improve as they go along. And, you know, the onus is on us really recognizing the staggering costs and consequences of not paying attention to governance, to really try and integrate it into our approach in responding to this pandemic. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks. And that vote of confidence in Inspector General, which is particularly relevant maybe for our times. Chris.
So just very quickly, and if I can maybe wrap in a short response to Carol and Alan and finish up here. I mean, I think we have to, it's true that everybody plays to their interests even in moments of emergency, but there are, I think we've seen already around the world, there are other things that governments do. Sometimes governments just follow the lead of others. And sometimes in a moment of this kind of crisis, they're more amenable to very specific, thought through proposals about what they might do that's new. And I think both those forces might help overcome some of the intransigence that Alan and Carol are pointing to. For me, it really comes down to being clear what we mean by integrity. I think you can't fight corruption just by whacking each instance of corruption. You have to have a vision of what it means to lead and work and govern with integrity. And I think in this moment, nothing is more powerful than the invocation of a public interest that is not just about selfishness, that is not just about protect me. And I think if we can build a consensus, if we can build a habit of response around integrity defined around the public interest that is more than the sum of private interests, it can help us both through this crisis and in the longer term on everything from climate change to global inequality.
Thank you, Chris, Catherine, Julie, for this great discussion. Thank you all in the audience for attending. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of the questions. We will be following up by sending you all a link to the recording of this session and encourage you to share it with others if you found it interesting, and I hope you all did. Thank you and happy Tuesday to everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks all.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.